Travel through a big balloon at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he went higher and higher, higher and higher, 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 until he reached the moon in the month of June, and now he sits up there, the man on the moon.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Valdemar Jacobson from Book Security, and I'm your chair for this room. For this next session, we've got Mark Krischer from Cisco Asia Pacific as the Principal Security Architect, talking about something that is very prescient and at the fore of everybody's minds on the topic of security implications of the hybrid workspace. Please welcome Mark.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. And by everyone, I mean those of you in this room and those of you joining us virtually. My name is Mark Krischer, and I'm very pleased to be with you all here today, here physically. Last year this time, wasn't really sure this event was going to happen. Put all that work into my Prezzo, and thankfully was able to deliver it even from home in September. And kudos to the AusCERT team for taking a physical event and completely flipping it and making it into a virtual event that we had. But here we are this year with a hybrid event. And looking at the numbers at the start of the week, we've got you guys in the room, but roughly 40% of the attendees are joining us virtually. And that's really what I want to talk about over the next 40-odd minutes or so, is this idea of the hybrid workplace, that it is truly hybrid. This is no longer about we're all going back to work or we're being remote. It's really how do we bring those two together, and what are the security implications of that happening? Now, I joined Cisco coming on 20 years ago. I got acquired as part of an acquisition, a small Australian startup called Radiata. We did wireless. Just to put in context how old that was, we were doing 802.11a. Of course, the current standard is now 802.11ax. But when we joined, being the young ideological engineer that I was at the time, I was really taken by the company vision at the time, right? Changing the way we work, live, play, and learn. I thought that was pretty cool. We were in wireless. That's what we were doing. And now, fast forward to where we are today, got to give credit where credit is due. COVID-19 also managed to change the way we work, live, play, and learn, and managed to do it in less than 6 months. Of course, what does that tie into? That ties into really our industry, IT, as an enabler, IT being able to allow for that business continuity. 9 in 10 Australian companies took on new technologies in order to have that business continuity, allowing 3.2 million Australian workers to continue to work. And you look at where we are as a country, and I think we're pretty lucky here compared to other parts of the world, not just in terms of the pandemic itself, but from an economic perspective as well. And one of the things, it's not like remote work was anything new, telecommuting was anything new. One of the interesting things that changed was the mindset of business. So prior to last year, there was a perception that if we let people work from home, that's going to be bad from productivity, right? We don't know if anybody's actually doing work. But last year actually was a really good experiment. And in fact, 41% of Australian companies found that the opposite was actually true. They saw an increase in productivity. Now, what's interesting when you look at those companies, as distinct from those who just saw flat productivity or even a decrease, it was not just the technology, but the processes and the policies they put in place to support it. right? And so that becomes very important when we think about the hybrid workplace and what is going to need to be done, both from a technology, but also a policy place to allow that to work. Because this is not about, let's just do remote access if people need to work from home. This is about, I need to have the exact same quality of experience, the same capabilities, irrespective of whether I am in the office or home. And I need to support that in a seamless transition between those. Now, McKinsey did some interesting work over the past year, really looking at the nature of work and trying to understand the applicability of remote work. And in advanced economies like ours, what they found was that basically 20 to 25% of workers across all different types of verticals and environments, 20 to 25% of the job functions, they could work 3 to 5 days a week without productivity impact. And that's, your typical computer-based office work. And, case in point to this, change to hybrid, last week was the first time I actually went back into the office. 14 months I have not been in the office, been working from home. And it wasn't just to go in for the sake of going in. The idea was we actually had, the team was going to get together. We're going to have a meeting physically in the office. Wake up that morning. If you're from Sydney, you'll remember we had a torrential downpour that morning. So alarm goes off. I'm thinking, God, I really picked the wrong day to go into the office. And I wasn't the only one who had that thought, because when we get to the office, get to the meeting, about a third of the group were joining over WebEx video, and we had a truly hybrid meeting, exactly what we are doing here today. And so that is really this point of supporting both pieces. Now, how do we do that, right? In order to make that happen, we've got to be doing this as a digital first motion. What can be delivered digitally must be delivered digitally. And I make that point digital first because often we talk about cloud first, a cloud first strategy. And to be clear, that's really not the strategy. The strategy is digital first. Cloud first is how I'm going to implement that digital first strategy. And case in point on this is we need to allow things to work wherever I am, which means I have to digitize it. So my wife is a sonographer. So while last year I was working from home, the kids were, attending school from home, she had to go into the office. The way ultrasound works, you need a sonographer, you need an ultrasound machine, and you need a patient, and they all need to be physically in the same room. Otherwise, it really doesn't work. However, the radiologist, he didn't come into the office for months and months and months because all of those scans got transmitted digitally. He was able to do his work remotely. And so we recognize there is an element in terms of job function. So last year, obviously, huge race around this, but it wasn't like it was brand new. Most organizations already had a digital transformation strategy in place. We've been talking about digital transformation for, coming on a decade now. What changed was kind of the prioritization and the acceleration. And so, saw a huge amount of stats last year, things like, what used to take, a bunch of years, we did in 8 weeks. But, being security people, as we are in this room, we know what probably happened there, right? You can do things fast, you can do them well, you can do them secure. You're probably not going to do all three. And so while we did see a huge amount of acceleration in that digital transformation there, things like what happened with e-commerce, with cloud, with the rise of video, whether or not we did things really as we should or just did it quick because everybody was working from home, that's what we need to be thinking about now. We need to be refactoring what was done. And that's a lot of what I've been doing with customers now. All right, let's look at what we did. Let's look at what we need to do. And do we need to kind of make some changes along those lines? Because it wasn't just the business industry that was in that acceleration phase, right? It was the criminals as well. 6-fold increase in cyber attacks last year, targeting this new attack vector of remote work. right? Which again comes down to what do we need to be thinking about? What new attack vectors are we going to be introducing? Because it's now not just one or the other, it really is this hybrid approach. So what I'd like to look at is really these three different elements that we need to bring to bear in order to deliver this, right? So we need our secure remote access, right? That's that remote work piece. In terms of the applications I'm connecting to, that's access to the secure hybrid and the multi-cloud. But also I want to introduce this idea of the trusted workplace because again, there is this physical element as well. A couple different things fold into that. One is what's happening from this digitization space, but in the employee safety part. So doing a lot of work with customers around how they're starting to use location analytics in order to do things like contact tracing. So if someone is diagnosed with COVID, what does that mean? Does everybody have to go home? Are there certain segments, only that area was impacted? That sort of idea. Also, if people are coming in and out, not spending all the time, what does that mean from a space utilization perspective? Do I need the whole big office that I had before, or can I take a different approach? And if people aren't always there, how does that tie into things like building automation, and what can I do to make more effective use of that office space, energy, and things along those lines? On the other end of the spectrum is really the Internet of Things, right? Thinking of all the devices that I have for work function, which now, because of digitization, I actually need to have more connected than maybe I did in the past. And what does that mean that I now need to do? So to address these, there's three different security methodologies I want to talk about today: Zero Trust, Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE, and microsegmentation. Right, and looking at how that's going to help us address. Obviously, whole range of things we can do in the security space. What I'm suggesting is with these three things, if we focus there, that'll allow us to address what we need to. So let's start with Zero Trust. One of the things I always kind of thought was cool about Zero Trust, this idea, Zero Trust does not mean no trust. In fact, the opposite is fundamentally true, right? I cannot implement a zero trust methodology if I do not have the ability to establish trust. It's that ability to establish trust that's allowing me to do what I want to do here. And let's be clear, zero trust is a fundamental change in what we have traditionally done from a secure access approach, right? Typically what we're saying, right, trust is established on access, which of course we know means, well, once I'm in, I get to play with whatever I can touch from there. But the other piece is trust is coupled to location, the location when I gain access. The challenge there is, in the world of mobility that we have today, what does trust, what does location now mean? Where I connected is not necessarily where I am now as I progress. On the flip side, right, what I'm connecting to. Virtual services are created and destroyed on the fly, on demand, and then, of course, extending into this idea of the hybrid workplace. So if I now look at what Zero Trust does differently, I'm going to establish trust for every request. And so what that means is I'm establishing a security perimeter every place that I am making an access control decision, which has the byproduct now of helping me decouple this from location. So now I'm better able to handle things as I cross these different domains. Now, Zero Trust needs to actually extend beyond just the access. There's oftentimes people think Zero Trust means multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication is a part of Zero Trust. That's how I'm going to establish trust. But after I establish trust, I'm using that now to define policies, which I need to enforce across the network to the applications. And the idea of trust but verify, I need to be constantly inspecting in order to ensure that nothing has changed in that trust relationship, therefore needing to change how I do the enforcement. It's also extending across IT in the sense that, yes, we've got our typical user devices, again, where we're doing that multi-factor authentication. So that is my workforce. I'm talking about access not just to the network, but to the applications the work loads. And then again, on this IoT space, I've got these non-user devices. I have to have a way of trusting them for access to the network and to the applications, right? That's my workplace. And so looking at across these three, and now how that's going to extend. So I'm now extending to the apps, to the cloud, right? And so that's our second piece, which is Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE. SASE is kind of interesting in the sense that it didn't come out of industry from vendors or a research project at some university, like for those of you who were in the previous session that we saw. This actually came from an analyst. It came from Gartner. And Gartner was looking at the trends that they were seeing through their customers. So on the one hand, you had the network side and software-defined WAN. On the other side, you had the security groups and the idea of security as a service. And what they were looking at was bringing those together, both from a consumption model as well as a functionality perspective. And so that was this concept of Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE. So again, how did we kind of get here? Where did it start? So it really started from the WAN perspective and really started from the location of the apps, the data center perspective. Everything was connected to the data center because that's where the apps were. The work functions were all data center applications, right? So if you looked at the traffic flows, the majority of all traffic went there and ended there. Internet traffic was in the minority. And so whether I was in the corporate headquarters, which maybe was where we co-located the data center, or the branches, or even remote, everything ultimately went there. And the advantage of that was, since you had to go there anyway, now I can put my security stack, that becomes my perimeter for that secure access. Of course, that really has not been the model for a very long time, despite the fact that we've still kind of maintained it. We're really in a internet cloud-centric sort of model. That 80-20 has shifted considerably. And so where things really started was actually from, forget security, this was a financial decision, right? I'm paying a lot of money for these MPLS links in order to tunnel traffic to a data center only to have internet access. So how do I look at doing some form of shift there, have the breakout to internet, right? And so that's where things started in the early days, concepts of intelligent WAN, which was really looking at intelligent path selection. Where do I need to route the traffic? What sort of interface? But that has evolved considerably to the software-defined WAN, which is looking beyond just that path selection, adding in WAN link redundancy, and really getting now a focus on not just access to the WAN, but servicing the applications. How do I ensure the quality of experience from that perspective and optimize for that? The way we handle that more complex environment is effectively the creation of a SD-WAN fabric. And what that is really buying me is an automated, a programmable type of structure, which gives me the flexibility I need. Now, that was the network guys. On the security side of the house, the problem was, hold on, all these guys now are connecting to internet-based services. We've got shadow IT and all the problems that came with that. And I've lost my security stack in the data center as the perimeter. So what am I going to do there? So that's where we started to see this idea of security as a service, giving these secure access capabilities. Once we started convincing the business that, hey, you need to take this a little bit seriously, then it started, well, how do I get access to those securely? That's where now we brought in the zero trust element. People wanted single sign-on. And so that's kind of where that piece evolved. And again, Gartner came and said, let's wrap this together. One, from a consumption model, but still bringing in a bit of the cost aspect, but more importantly, looking at how we can get the interaction between those two pieces. And that's kind of where the industry is right now. You've got a lot of evolution that's happened on both the SD-WAN and the security as a service side. Now the interesting work is how do we bring those things together. Now, again, this is hybrid, so we're going to need to look at the remote piece. Before we do, one of the interesting things, again, is where are the apps, right? And how is that moving? So VMware obviously has a vested interest in this. And they did some interesting work last year. One, they were just looking at the state of the nation in terms of cloud, but also from the perspective of what was the impact of the pandemic and some of the reprioritization that had been done. And the interesting piece is, even though a number of activities got accelerated, at the end of the day, nearly half of companies have been working on cloud migration for 3 or more years. This is not some simple thing that we're going to do. It's not just, well, why can't you take it off of one server and go virtualize it and put it in the cloud? It doesn't quite work that simply. And so we're going to have for quite a while a large number of apps that do need to maintain, within, whether it's the data center, a private cloud instance, whatever has been done and we look at. But what that implies is I am going to need something like a VPN type tunnel in order to get me that access to that internal network. I still will have all my SaaS-based solutions, my internet-based solutions, and there I can use the same security as a service stack that we had on the SASE side. And again, that goes back to I want to maintain parity in this hybrid environment, irrespective of where I am. And that's one way that we do it, by using the same services irrespective of the location. The other piece here is, just like with the early SD-WAN days of the path selection, I want to do that if I have to have VPN as well, right? Just because I need VPN doesn't mean now I want to tunnel all traffic into that VPN. If I'm accessing the SaaS-based services, I want that intelligent path selection to just go direct out. In fact, looking at what Cisco as an IT organization, not Cisco the vendor, but our internal IT org, when we shifted to globally work from home, we shut down every office globally in a matter of weeks. One of the first things Cisco IT needed to do was switch on split tunneling, both whether people were using the AnyConnect soft client and those people like me that actually had the hardware Cisco Virtual Office router, because before they never bothered putting that in place because, well, it didn't matter. Now all of a sudden, every Cisco employee was hammering that VPN concentrator. They needed to make that change in order to make it scale. So that takes us, to the WAN piece. The last thing that we need to now be thinking about is, all right, well, I've got the WAN to access the applications. What about my actual internal network itself, my LAN environment? And here's where we're going to look at our third element, which is microsegmentation. Now, again, I want to kind of start with where we were, or where some of us still are today, right? Network segmentation traditionally was done, really on a VLAN basis, right? So all I had was a data network. 20 years ago, we started to see voice over IP come in. I needed a voice VLAN, and really, we didn't do that for security. We did that for quality of service. 15 years ago, we started to see a lot of wireless mobile devices. Now I need to have guest capabilities. And so all of these were really done from a static ACL perspective. Given this is AusCERT, I'm sure all of you have your own horror stories about massive ACLs. I work with a bunch of customers. They've got thousands, tens of thousands of lines of ACLs. ACLs that they cannot touch because absolutely no one remembers what half of those lines are for. If they make changes, if they remove them, what are they going to break? What holes are they going to open? And really the challenge that we are facing here is that we've got this static implementation of my security policy, which is coupled to my network topology. So every time now I go and add some new service, I've got to make changes not just to my network topology, but to my security policy as well. And of course, it's not just within this environment. I now need to somehow translate that policy to my WAN and into the cloud for the apps. And so this is kind of where we are today. We put a lot of Band-Aids on this, trying to do things, we call it dynamic ACLs, for example. It's not really dynamic. The only thing that's dynamic is my decision point as to which static set of ACLs to apply. The flexibility isn't there, which is why I'm stuck with more of a macro segmentation, because I simply can't do the implementation to get the granularity that I need. So that takes us to kind of where we are starting to see today. Lots of different terminology for the point of our discussion today. We'll just call it a software-defined perimeter. But the idea is I need to decouple my security policy from my network topology. And what I'm looking to make that happen is actually a software-defined network fabric. Right? Again, lots of different ways people are doing that, but ultimately I'm after something programmable. I'm after automation in my network configuration, because now what that's doing is allowing me to decouple that security policy from the network policy. In fact, what it's also doing is allowing me to decouple security policy from my security implementation. What do I mean by that? Well, think back to that big giant list of the ACLs. That was not just the security policy implementation. That was the policy. You might say, well, no, we've got a whole document, which is our security policy, which then gets what? Translated manually into the ACLs. Any translation error, any human input error means that that is really what the policy is. So those ACLs are the policy. And then trying to take that and translate them across my domain. So now what I can do is I can abstract that, define my security policy with something, like a matrix type structure. The software-defined network fabric, that is what is responsible for translating that to the network policy, the network implementation. Right? And so the other kind of nice benefit here is I can now make it completely dynamic. And so I can do things like taking the context into place and not just change it on access, but be changing things on the fly. Additionally, because of this abstraction that I've done from the policy to the implementation, and because my network fabric is effectively programmable with APIs, and because my software-defined WAN is a programmable fabric with APIs, because my cloud implementations are programmable with APIs, translating those security policies between these domains is now something that I can do practically, right? There is a path, there is a vehicle to make that happen. And so I am now doing, using my context, and what do I want to do now? I want to effectively classify, and again, lots of terminology in use in the industry, security groups, security tags, security labels, all really trying to achieve the same thing, which is let me classify who is coming into my network, define policy on what can be done, and again, I can now add a bit more dynamic nature to this. So maybe my BYOD device, when I'm in the office, I get full access. Then when I'm remote, I want to change what I'm allowed to access. Maybe I haven't updated iOS on my phone, and so I'm still got the WebKit vulnerabilities from last week, so now I want to quarantine that traffic. Point is, I can make those changes based on the context, and again, now that policy ties in not just through the network, but across the WAN into the cloud, because I've been able to translate those policies across the domains. Okay? So that's kind of looking at what we're trying to do. The last piece then, in terms of this access part, again, comes back to these IoT devices, these non-user devices. And really the challenge that we have here is the capabilities are all over the shop, right? I mean, it really could be anything from, allows me to put on certs, do .1x, to absolutely nothing. As recent as last year, I was dealing with a customer, they had these wireless voice over IP handsets that was linked into the business applications. They couldn't change, and they only supported web. I'm like, guys, work with me here at least a little bit. And so what do we do in that scenario? What have we done in that scenario? Well, we just use MAC-off bypass and we kind of cover our eyes and lock down that VLAN and hope for the best, right? So with now the ability to implement microsegmentation, what are some things that I might do differently? So device profiling, that's nothing new. We've been doing it for a while. But now I want to use it for device classification, right? And in doing so, now I can, again, do that grouping, apply those tags, labels, whatever term you're going to use. So as an example, hospital brings in a brand new piece of medical imaging equipment, right? I profile it, I recognize it as medical imaging equipment. I already have a policy in place for what I do with traffic from medical imaging, and now I just automatically apply it to this new device that's been introduced. Because remember, when we talk about hybrid workplace and making things work irrespective of location, that's not just for the business users, that includes the IT organization as well. We need to be able to work in this hybrid mode as well. So anything that I can do at an automated way from a remote way without needing to be physically on site is equally important to making this happen. So now let's kind of apply those zero trust principles. So I've got my device, you know, it could be a scanner, a camera. We do the profiling. So I've established trust based on how I'm able to do the access control, the authentication onto the network, because again, it's the business deciding those products, and sometimes they make bad decisions without talking to us first. So based on that level of trust, that will decide, you know, what I'm looking to do there. I'm then going to enforce the policy because I've classified it. And then remember, the third part of zero trust is inspect. And there's been a huge amount of really interesting work being done around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and that applies really nicely into a scenario like this. Because I can baseline the traffic from those devices, now I can detect anomalies and recognize, hey, you know, actually maybe it's not quite what I thought it was, you know, what my profiling told me that it was, and I can dynamically adjust how I'm going to handle with that traffic. So let's kind of take a step back and now put all these pieces together. I've got my network fabric, which again is giving me that programmability and the flexibility. I've got my zero trust elements, and that's linking into my ability to do the micro-segmentation, crossing over the WAN with SASE into the hybrid and the multi-cloud, getting those policies all applied. The last thing to think about here is that network fabric actually gives me a little bit more flexibility than simply making, you know, a Boolean permit or deny decision. That network fabric also allows me to change the traffic flow, to look at where I'm sending that traffic, which I can use to insert security services. So kind of taking some of the ideas and concepts from that SASE model of the blend of SD-WAN and security as a service, I'm trying to do that now within my campus fabric environment. And so going back to that medical imaging equipment example, right? Yes, it's new. Yes, I've discovered that it looks like medical imaging equipment, but it is new. I don't quite trust it yet. So now I have the ability to divert the flow, get a bit of additional inspection on there, maybe sending it through a next-gen firewall, and establish that level of trust from a security organization perspective. Maybe get to the point where, yes, our machine learning has done the baseline, and now we have some level of confidence if we do profiling of new devices coming into the network from that perspective. And again, we can do this because I've got that software-defined network fabric, which is giving me that flexibility. Same thing that then I'm taking into the SD-WAN with the SD-WAN fabric. Same thing that I'm looking to do. In fact, all of the data center guys and the DevOps guys are doing in the cloud space, both private and public cloud. So I've taken these three different security methodologies, right? Zero trust, SASE, micro-segmentation. And the idea here is we've actually taken them and used security as an enabler. Right? Oftentimes, security gets accused of hindering the business. When we look at what happened last year with the need to make things happen so quickly, as we know, kind of security sometimes took a bit of a sideline there because it really was about getting the business back up and running. But here, we're able to make security as an enabler to allow us to do what we need to do, to enable these different areas of secure remote access, secure access to the hybrid and the multi-cloud, and now enable this idea of the trusted workplace, and ultimately deliver on the secure hybrid workplace. And in doing so, maybe changing the way we work, live, play, and learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. On behalf of the conference, just a small gift.
Oh, very cool.
And at the moment, I can't see any questions from our remote or local audience in here. So obviously, you've given them a very comprehensive view, or you've completely bamboozled the audience. Do you have any comments on what potential gaps or future ideas you might have in the way that you're looking at this architectural approach, potentially also in a multi-vendor environment, as opposed to one where you've got the ability to interact and instrument every single network control access point?
Well, I guess that piece there definitely goes through what we've done. So I don't pretend in any way, shape, or form that Cisco addresses every element that I discussed, and very much looking at how do you take the multi-vendor pieces. But what I would suggest is important is thinking about that programmable piece, and what makes it work is how it all integrates. So even in a multi-vendor environment, we need to look at ways that it is able to stitch those together. Having one of those security elements that sits by itself really no longer addresses what we are trying to do. So even in the Cisco sense, where we don't cover every single element, we're typically looking at how do we integrate with third-party solutions to allow that continuity.
So we've got a couple of questions finally come through.
Oh, now they're coming through.
And now they're coming through. Are we increasing the attack vector with this approach? If someone manages to change the tag, then they can do whatever they want in the network. And that's kind of my concern here with a kind of both with an identity SASE-based control, plus also just a network-only component rather than something that goes all the way out to the endpoints and actually understands services.
No, it is a fair point, but I would argue some of that comes more to the implementation rather than the underlying technology approach. And really, I mean, everything in security is always a balance. And hopefully what came across, and the reason why I try to spend time looking at, where we came from, was where we came from is simply unworkable. I need more flexibility. And 100%, I need to make sure that introducing flexibility does not extend my attack surface and create more problems. But by the same token, the reality that we have here in this room today with people joining us remotely and people physically here, that is what it's going to be. So the question is, how do we address that reality?
So somebody else is asking, could you give us a real-world example?
A real-world example. So I had already given the example, just from a work experience. I would argue some of this is a real-world example, but that's more on the hybrid workplace. I suspect what you mean a real-world example in terms of taking these technologies and stitching them together. So look, the real-world example I'm going to give you is, again, that Cisco IT sense, because this is what we had to implement. And you may say, oh, with Cisco IT, they've got easy access to all the Cisco products. Yes, to some extent, but they also do their due diligence just like every other IT organization that they work. They're also sometimes our worst customers because they always complain about things and think they should be able to get their changes put in place. But that is exactly what Cisco IT did from the pandemic and then really planning the return to work. So we have gone completely Duo for Zero Trust. Granted that is a Cisco acquisition, but that was already being put in place before the pandemic. So we were already going down that path. And in fact, our remote work capabilities were already in place. So one of the reasons why we were able to pivot so quickly was not because it was Cisco IT, but because of the digital transformation work that had been done, well before. We were already moving in this direction. And so same with the SD-WAN piece. The micro-segmentation is probably the hardest bit. And looking from a global company perspective, at the moment, the focus has really been on some of our development sites in China and India. We haven't necessarily brought it to, say, the sales office here in Brisbane or down in Sydney or Melbourne.
So I'll make this one our last question for now. One that I was already discussing with somebody else earlier today, or last night it might have been. It's the whole concept of automating mistakes at scale. How do you avoid human error in increasing your automation? And some of the discussion I was having yesterday around this was the whole concept of, well, you've got to automate everything, but do you have multiple teams or different automation groups to actually still have some sort of overlapping control, rather than it be, I've made the mistake here, that same mistake to be deployed everywhere?
I would argue it goes back to what I said before about what we had before was simply untenable. So you guys are asking for real-world examples. I'll give a real-world example. We had working with a manufacturing site in China, and the old way of doing things with that coupling of security policy and network topology had two challenges. One, every change was really manual and therefore resource intensive, and also, to your point, introduced mistakes. The OT side of the house that was driving the requirements, they were focused constantly on, we need to be able to make changes quickly. They had new things they wanted to do every week, and IT simply could not keep up. So automation was just fundamentally necessary. But what was interesting is, yes, mistakes do have a chance to propagate, but the risk of those mistakes decreases dramatically because now it's not so manual intensive. It's not coming down to a line of ACL, but rather a simple policy based design, designing my intent, which then gets implemented by the controller. You always want to have multiple levels so that if there is an error, how do I detect that so then I can go and make the change? But I would fundamentally argue that the risk is too high to go there. I would argue there is no choice. We must. Therefore, let's figure out the policies and approach in order to prevent the issues from coming up.
So at the end of the day, this is one half of the solution. You've still got to have your comprehensive logging and incident response capability to pick up on both human errors and malicious activity.
As I said, these three areas, I'm saying what we need to do in order to put this in place, that is not where we stop.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. That's been a great and very informative talk.
Thank you all very much.
Next talk in here will be starting in a couple of minutes. And if you have a ticket to the conference dinner tonight but no longer need it, just let the registration desk out the front know, because there's a wait list. Cheers.
I would like to get to know you're the kind of guy